So I'm Paul Graff. That's me in the hot dog costume right there. And then I work for a company called Social Assurance in Lincoln. And I drove up to hang out with you guys and talk about AngularJS directives. Cool. So yeah, I have three main points I kind of want to get across during this talk. First would just be like some common use cases for Angular directives. Next, I'll kind of like run through the process of building a pretty simple, trivial directive that kind of just outlines how they work. And then finally, I'll kind of recap by talking about what I think are like the really great parts of it and the parts that kind of suck. So you're probably wondering, AngularJS. How many of you guys were here for Jared's talk? Jared's right there. It was really great. I liked it a lot. Not really much of a shout out. I mean, okay, whatever. But if you weren't here for that, you should definitely check it out if you're interested in Angular, because he did a really great job kind of giving some great background into what Angular is and ran through a great example. So yeah, it's all on the Nebraska.js website, so check it out. But if you're unfamiliar with it, Angular is an MVC framework for JavaScript applications created by Google in like 2009. And it's like very opinionated. It says, you know, DOM manipulation and your app logic should be completely separate. So they created these things called directives to kind of facilitate that. And I have a little bit of jargon for you before we go too deep. I have it all listed right here. But first off, in Angular, controllers are basically a type that encapsulates some app logic. So they have like you kind of nest them within a page, and they kind of create a scope where you can sort of manage your data bindings there. Gosh, so much jargon, I'm sorry. And then, so this controller has a scope, and a scope is basically an object that links between the view and the model, so you can sort of bind data to the view and all that stuff. And then finally, nested controllers inherit properties from their parent controllers, so they can just read, data from their parent controllers. So let's see. All right, and so first I was going to talk about when directives are useful, and there are two like main cases that I really found. First is basically creating reusable components within your application. So if you just want to, if you have some common functionality that you're kind of creating, like maybe it's a drop-down calendar, something like that you find yourself using throughout an application, these directives make it really easy just to sort of bundle that all together, and then you can declaratively just drop it right into your HTML. And then the second case that they're really good for is sort of handling like any kind of DOM manipulation in your application, as well as like binding jQuery plugins in. And I'll explain why that makes sense in a little bit. So cool. Here's the demo I'm going to do. It's going to magically work. All right. Okay, so like I said, this is really simple. And it doesn't work. Okay. Rather than trying to debug that, I'll just kind of, it wasn't that cool anyway, so you aren't really missing much. It was just a tooltip, foundation tooltip. But anyway, this example is useful for kind of going over a directive. So this is sort of the normal Angular stuff right here. You create a module, and then after you have a module, you add a controller to it. This one's pre-original name, test control. And it has a scope variable called definitions, which is just an object containing like these dictionary values, which would be corresponding with a tooltip. So yeah, it says cool tooltip, and the tooltip is going to say, wow, check me out. But it doesn't. So. Anyway, so you can find everything over here, and it's real dandy. ng app is test app, ng controller is test control. And here's the part that I want to talk about, the directive.
Can you zoom?
Zoom? Yes. Sorry about that. You know what? Output's useless anyway. Okay. Sweet. Can everyone Cool. Is that good? Okay. So the directive right here. Basically, it's sort of really similar to the controller, and you give it a name, and then you pass in a function that returns this object containing all this jargon right here. And so I'll start kind of explaining all the jargon. The first thing you see right here is restrict, and then you see ace. It's not just an arbitrary string. Each of those letters corresponds with attribute, class, and element. And so that kind of defines exactly how you can sort of add this directive to the DOM. So if you see over here, it just says tooltip thing. That's the element name. And that's acceptable because I have the E over there. Cool demo for you. Yeah. Okay. So if I just make this a div right here, then I can just class equals tool tip thing. Okay, yeah. This demo would make more sense if the is actually showing you what was happening. But this is essentially equivalent because he said that you can use an attribute, class, or element. The next thing is the template. And this is sort of where it's, you know, if you're actually creating like a component, this is really useful to be able to have a template you can specify, which, you know, you can basically, when combined with the controller, it just kind of acts like any of the pages you create with an Angular application. You can either use a string or you can use a template URL. Template URLs are way more useful. They don't look stupid. This looks kind of dumb. But it's easy to do with this, the JSO or JSBin.
Does the class name have to match the directive name then?
No, so that's sort of a weird thing. Basically, to be HTML compliant, they want you to use, someone can maybe help me out here. I heard a fancy name for it earlier, but is it like dash case or dash something? I don't know. Matt Sikowski told me about it. It seemed legit. Cool, so after the template, move on to the scope. And that basically like creates a scope for the directive. If you don't specify one, then basically it just steals the parent scope, which is kind of dangerous because everything that happens in your directive can directly modify the parent's variables, which may not be what you want. And so by specifying like an object right here, that this is called the isolate scope, which is an Angular buzzword. And basically by doing this, I'm saying I'm only going to allow this variable or this scope variable called dictionary to be shared between the parent scope and the directive. Yeah, did you have a question?
Yeah, so on your scope you have definitions, but within your template you say definition without an S. Is that the problem that we're running into, not seeing it on the screen?
Oh, yeah, so the definitions is actually up here.
Right, but within the title when you're pulling up the binding, it says definition without an S. Is there a reason for that?
That's true.
Definition.text, definition.tooltip?
Inside your template, you have a singular definition.tooltip.
Right, it's not matching your scope binding.
No, your template string on the right.
Your directed template.
Okay, yeah, sorry. Yeah, so this is actually referring to this definition right here.
Oh, okay.
There you go.
Yeah. Sorry about that. But yeah, anyway, so the ISO scope just basically allows you to share a particular, specify like what you're sharing between the parent and the directive. And that's all facilitated through having attributes on the element. So in this case, I'm saying I expect a dictionary attribute, and whatever is passed in here, like definitions, for instance, is what the variable on the scope and the parent is, and then they get shared. So that's how that works. Let's see. And so yeah, then you have a controller, and this basically behaves like a normal Angular controller. Alright. Cool. Okay. Cool. So there's some stuff like with directives, kind of like you just experienced, there's just tons of jargon that you have to kind of get through, and there's lots of things you have to learn to actually be able to create a useful directive. And most of the time it's like not really as painful as it kind of makes it sound. Like transclusion, for instance, that sounds really complicated, but basically using transclusion is just like, it's a setting in your directive that allows you to basically embed HTML in the directive from in the context of like wherever you're declaring it. And so if you have just some directive that you want to extend with a custom message or something like that, then basically whatever HTML you put inside that directive in the particular page, or sorry, HTML or page you're working with just instantly appears inside the directive. So that kind of makes it easy. But yeah, there's all this other stuff. You kind of have to hit the docs to figure out what all that means. But it's all useful. But despite all that, I don't know, I think directives are really awesome. I think if you can sort of like get over that hump of figuring out sort of what all those things mean, you end up with some really cool declarative reusable components that you kind of sprinkle throughout your app. And it sort of simplifies the process, again, of development in a big application where you can sort of just build out these directives and share them throughout the application. And then, the isolate scope and bidirectional data binding is a cool feature that isn't really a part of regular controllers. So you can really use those to your advantage in directives to sort of get some isolation going on and not have to worry about clobbering stuff. But throughout all this, you're probably wondering, do I need directives? I could probably do a lot of stuff with a controller and just some regular templates. My answer is probably. If anything, you'll just use them to, sort of wrangle jQuery in your application. But if you do end up using them, they are really helpful, and I think they are a part of what makes Angular a really great framework. So here's some resources that, if you're interested, are sort of a great way to get into directives. The first one's a YouTube video that's a presentation by the guy that created Angular. So he sort of goes over like the really complicated jargony stuff super well. So I recommend that. And then Egghead is super solid too. And any questions? Cool. Thanks, guys.